October 1965. The wind blowing off the dark, churning waters of the Harlem River carried a vicious, unnatural bite. It was a cold, invisible razor that swept down the wide avenues, rattling the iron grates of the storefronts and whispering a harsh warning of a bitter, unforgiving winter yet to come. The streets were slick with a fine, freezing mist that settled over the concrete like a shroud, reflecting the neon glow of the liquor stores, the late-night diners, and the corner pawnshops in fractured pools of bleeding red and bruised blue light. It was the kind of night that kept honest people locked firmly behind their heavy deadbolts, sitting close to their radiators, listening to the anxious rattle of their window panes. But on this particular evening, the true, pulsating heartbeat of the city wasn't out on the freezing, miserable pavement. It was sealed safely inside the walls of the Lenox Grand. The Lenox Grand was an exclusive, fortified social club that sat like an impenetrable, red brick fortress in the very center of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's sprawling kingdom. Tonight was not just another gathering of the underworld elite, the politicians, and the quiet men who ran the hidden machinery of New York City. Tonight was a milestone that very few men in this particular, perilous line of work ever lived to see. The undisputed, uncontested godfather of Harlem was turning 60 years old. To reach 60 in the life Bumpy had chosen was a miracle of mathematics and sheer, unadulterated willpower. Most men who chased the crown ended up as a fading memory before they saw 30, their names whispered in quiet tones over cheap whiskey, their bodies resting under cold marble. But Bumpy had survived the bloodiest gang wars of the 1930s. He had survived the ruthless ambitions of Dutch Schultz. He had survived the psychological warfare and the damp, bone-chilling isolation of Alcatraz. He had outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and outlasted them all. And tonight, the fortress belonged entirely to him. Inside the grand ballroom of the Lenox Grand, the atmosphere was thick, intoxicating, and heavy with the undeniable gravity of absolute power. The air was a rich, layered tapestry of expensive scents. There was the sharp, spicy aroma of imported bay rum cologne, worn by the heavy hitters, mingling seamlessly with the sweet, earthy haze of hand-rolled Cuban cigars. Beneath it all was the delicate, intoxicating fragrance of expensive gardenia perfume, worn by the beautiful women who were dripping in flawless diamonds and heavy mink coats. At the far end of the sprawling room, elevated on a raised stage draped in heavy velvet, a 5-piece jazz band was laying down a slow, smoky rhythm. The stand-up bass thumped with a steady rhythmic pulse that seemed to match the beating hearts of the 200 carefully selected guests in attendance. A saxophone wept a slow, sultry melody that wrapped around the room like silk, a melancholic tune that spoke of old secrets and long, dangerous nights. Bumpy sat at the head table, elevated just slightly above the rest of the room, a quiet king surveying his court. He was a portrait of absolute, unshakable authority. He wore a masterfully tailored, midnight blue tuxedo, the expensive fabric absorbing the dim, golden light raining down from the massive crystal chandeliers above. The crisp, blinding white lines of his starched shirt and the flawless, symmetrical knot of his silk bow tie spoke of a man who controlled every minute detail of his existence. He did not tap his foot to the intoxicating music. He did not fidget with his silverware. He rested his hands on the immaculate white linen tablecloth, his long, elegant fingers completely, terrifyingly still. He simply observed. To his right sat Mamie. She was a vision, radiating the kind of quiet, unshakable dignity that commanded the room just as effectively as the armed men standing in the shadows by the exits. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk, that caught the ambient light whenever she shifted, her hair styled with immaculate, sweeping precision. Mamie was his anchor, his confidante, the absolute rock upon which he had built his life. She was the only person in the entire room who didn't look at him with a volatile mixture of fear, awe, and calculated ambition. She leaned in close, her voice a soft melodic murmur that was barely audible over the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low rumbling hum of conversation. "You look like a man plotting a war, Ellsworth," Mamie whispered, a knowing, profoundly affectionate smile touching the corners of her lips. She let her gaze sweep over the room before returning to his eyes. "Try to remember, it's a celebration. You earned this night." Bumpy turned his head, the sharp angles of his face softening for a fraction of a second as he looked at his wife. The cold, obsidian depths of his eyes, usually reserved for calculating the demise of his enemies, warmed slightly. "A king is always plotting, Mamie," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble wrapped in velvet, a sound that demanded absolute attention without ever raising in volume. "The day he stops plotting, the day he decides to just sit back and enjoy the music, that is the day they measure him for a wooden box. But for you, my love, I'll try to appreciate the melody." He picked up his champagne flute, the delicate crystal feeling cold and fragile against his skin, but he didn't drink. Instead, he let his gaze drift back over the sprawling ballroom. He saw the corrupt politicians who gladly took his thick envelopes every month, laughing far too loudly at jokes that weren't the least bit funny, their faces flushed with expensive wine and borrowed power. He saw the older Italian bosses from downtown, men who had crossed the invisible borders of the city to pay their respects. They sat with tight, nervous smiles, their eyes constantly darting to the exits, fully aware that they were deep inside territory they could never hope to conquer. And standing in the deep, impenetrable shadows near the heavy velvet drapes, he saw his own men, Harlem's finest, the men who ensured the numbers ran on time, the men who kept the streets quiet, the men who enforced the iron will of Ellsworth Johnson. Junie Byard stood near the main entrance to the ballroom, leaning against a towering marble pillar like a gargoyle carved from solid, immovable mahogany. Junie didn't wear a tuxedo. He despised them. Instead, he wore a sharply pressed, dark charcoal suit that violently struggled to contain the massive, coiled muscle of his frame. His eyes were cold, flat, and endlessly scanning. They constantly tracked the room, moving from the double doors to the high windows, calculating vectors, assessing lines of sight, searching for the slightest hint of a threat. Junie was the ultimate insurance policy. He was a man who spoke very little, but when he moved, it was with terrifying, lethal efficiency. He didn't draw his weapon to intimidate. If Junie Byard reached into his jacket, someone was about to stop breathing. Junie caught Bumpy's eye across the crowded room and gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. All secure. Bumpy returned the nod with a slow blink. The perimeter was tight. The fortress was locked down. But turning 60 was a dangerous, highly complex psychological threshold in the underworld. It was an age that signaled deep wisdom and unparalleled experience, yes. But to the young, reckless hustlers out on the freezing, unforgiving streets, it signaled something else entirely. It signaled weakness. It signaled that the old lion might finally be losing his sharp teeth, that his once lightning reflexes might be slowing down, that his iron grip on the vast, incredibly lucrative numbers rackets and the sprawling territory might finally be slipping. The streets were always hungry for fresh blood, and there was always a fool willing to bleed for a chance at the crown. And out in the biting, miserable cold of the Harlem night, A pack of rabid hyenas had decided it was time to test the lion. 4 blocks away, a heavy black Packard sedan was cutting through the freezing mist with its headlights completely turned off, gliding through the darkness like a mechanized predator. Inside the car sat 4 young men from a rogue Bronx faction. They were wild, profoundly undisciplined, and desperately hungry for a dangerous reputation they hadn't even begun to earn. They were a new breed, a generation that lacked the patience and the strategic brilliance of the men who had built the syndicates. They wore loud, flashy suits, plaid jackets, wide lapels, and bright fedoras that Bumpy would have instantly dismissed as a circus clown's uniform. They were vibrating with nervous, chaotic energy, passing a silver flask of cheap, burning whiskey back and forth in the dark, trying to drown their mounting terror in liquid courage. The heavy scent of cheap cologne and nervous sweat filled the claustrophobic cabin of the car. The leader of this foolish endeavor, a 22-year-old punk who went by the name Sterling, sat in the passenger seat. His hands were sweating so profusely they were leaving slick, oily marks on the heavy, freezing steel of the Thompson submachine gun resting heavily across his lap. Sterling was a creature of absolute, blinding arrogance. He was a fast talker with a dangerous ego, entirely convinced by his own fabricated street mythology. He had spent the last 2 weeks hyping his crew into a frenzy, convincing them that tonight, Halloween month of 1965, was the night the world changed. He had told them that Bumpy Johnson was nothing but a relic, a soft, aging man sitting in a warm, plush club surrounded by fat old men who had long forgotten how to fight a real war. "We don't even have to go inside, you dig?" Sterling had bragged earlier that evening, pacing around a smoky, poorly lit basement in the Bronx, his eyes wide and manic. "We roll up quiet. We light up the front doors. We shatter the glass. We show the whole jive city that the king can be touched. When his high-priced guards come pouring out into the street, all confused and panicking in the cold, we drop 'em where they stand. Then we hit the gas and vanish. By tomorrow morning, every corner boy, every numbers runner in the city is going to know that Bumpy's time is up. We take the throne, solid." It was a foolish, inherently suicidal plan, born of profound, fatal ignorance. They didn't understand the history of the man they were hunting. They didn't understand that Bumpy Johnson had written the very rules they were trying to break. They didn't understand the fundamental, unbreakable law of the Harlem underworld. Bumpy Johnson did not react. He calculated. The black Packard turned onto the main avenue, the heavy white wall tires hissing softly on the wet, freezing asphalt. Through the misty, smeared windshield, the Lenox Grand loomed ahead in the darkness. It looked incredibly peaceful from the outside. The massive, reinforced oak doors were shut tight against the cold, flanked by 2 ornate, wrought iron lanterns that cast a warm, inviting, golden glow onto the slick sidewalk. 2 of Bumpy's outside guards stood casually near the entrance, leaning against the brickwork. They wore heavy wool overcoats, their collars turned up against the wind, smoking cigarettes and quietly talking, their breath pluming in the frigid, icy air. "There it is, cats," Sterling hissed, his voice cracking slightly as a massive surge of pure adrenaline flooded his nervous system. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached down and violently racked the bolt of the Thompson, the heavy, metallic clack echoing loudly inside the confined space of the car. It was the sound of no return, Roll the windows down. Get ready to freeze. When I say the word, we paint the front of that place red. In the back seat, 2 more young shooters nervously raised their own weapons, a sawed-off shotgun and a heavy .45 caliber pistol. Their hands were shaking violently as the freezing, biting wind rushed into the car through the open windows, chilling them to the bone. The driver, a skinny kid with terrified eyes, swallowed hard and slowed the heavy Packard to a creeping crawl, easing it toward the curb directly in front of the brilliantly lit club. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere remained utterly serene. The jazz band had just seamlessly transitioned into a slow, melancholic blues number, the saxophone weeping a beautiful, mournful tune. Bumpy was in the middle of a quiet, highly sophisticated conversation with a prominent state judge, discussing the subtle nuances of local politics, when the perfect tranquility of the evening was violently, explosively shattered. It started as a deafening, mechanical roar that tore through the heavy masonry of the building, a sound so loud and sudden it felt like the sky was tearing open.
Tat, 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 tat. The sound of the Thompson submachine gun firing on full automatic was absolutely unmistakable. It was a chaotic, ragged, terrifying tearing noise, like heavy canvas being violently ripped apart by an angry, invisible giant. Outside in the freezing cold, Sterling and his crew were leaning far out of the Packard's windows, holding their triggers down, screaming into the wind as they unleashed a blind, deafening hail of lead at the front of the Lenox Grand.
The heavy bullets smashed into the wrought iron lanterns with explosive force, shattering the thick glass into a blinding shower of sparkling, lethal confetti. They hammered relentlessly against the thick, reinforced oak doors, ripping massive, jagged splinters of wood into the air. The sawed-off shotgun boomed, a thunderous crack that blew a massive hole in the decorative masonry above the entrance. Inside the foyer, the 2 guards who had been standing outside had instantly reacted with the honed instincts of combat veterans. The moment they saw the gun barrels clear the windows of the slow-moving car, they dove backward through the secondary interior doors, hitting the polished marble floor hard as the storm of lead rained down against the exterior of the building. In the grand ballroom, sheer, unadulterated chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. The beautiful music stopped with a screeching, discordant halt as the bass player dropped his expensive instrument and frantically dove behind the heavy wooden stage. Women screamed, a high-pitched, collective sound of absolute terror that cut sharply through the lingering, ringing echoes of the heavy gunfire. Dignitaries, hardened politicians, and ruthless mobsters alike abandoned their dignity and hit the floor, scrambling desperately under the heavy banquet tables. They knocked over crystal glasses, shattered expensive china, and sent bottles of rare vintage champagne crashing to the floor in a foaming, sticky mess. The elegant, refined, carefully controlled celebration dissolved into sheer, primal panic. But at the head table, the King of Harlem did not move a single inch. Bumpy Johnson remained perfectly seated. He didn't duck his head. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach inside his jacket for a weapon. He didn't even blink. He sat perfectly upright, his posture immaculate and regal, holding his crystal champagne flute suspended in the air, exactly halfway between the white linen tablecloth and his lips. His expression remained entirely blank, a mask of carved ebony. Mamie sat beside him, her back completely straight. She didn't scream. She didn't dive for cover. She slowly reached out, her emerald silk sleeve rustling softly, and placed her steady, warm hand over Bumpy's free hand that rested on the table. She knew him far too well. She knew the depth of his pride. She knew that diving under a table like a frightened rat was a public admission of fear, and Ellsworth Johnson would absolutely rather take a bullet straight to the chest than let a single soul in this room see him cower on his own birthday. Amateurs, Bumpy murmured softly, his voice a calm, steady island in the sea of screaming guests and shattered glass. He didn't look at the doors. He simply listened to the rhythm of the gunfire outside. His mind, sharper than a straight razor, instantly analyzed the acoustics. The firing was highly erratic. It was completely uncontrolled. They were spraying blindly from the street, aiming far too high, trying to cause maximum auditory terror rather than actually targeting any specific individual. It was a cowardly drive-by tactic, the desperate, noisy, unimaginative calling card of young, foolish punks who wanted to make a bold headline in the morning papers, not secure a confirmed hit. Junie Bard had moved the exact microsecond the very first shot rang out. He was suddenly, miraculously standing directly in front of Bumpy's table. He had positioned his massive, muscular body as a solid human shield between the king and the direction of the street. A heavy, blued steel Colt .45 was already drawn and resting casually by his side, an extension of his own arm. Junie didn't look panicked. He didn't look scared. He looked deeply, profoundly annoyed, as if a drunken patron had just rudely bumped into him and spilled a drink on his favorite, freshly shined shoes. "You want me to take the boys out the back exit and flank the street, boss?" Junie asked, his voice a low, steady rumbling bass that easily cut through the hysterical crying of a woman hiding under the next table. "We can box their car in before they hit the avenue. Light 'em up from the alleyway. Leave 'em bleeding in the snow." Around the perimeter of the sprawling room, 30 of Bumpy's top enforcers had already drawn their weapons. The click of heavy hammers being pulled back on revolvers and shotguns echoed from the shadows. They were crouched low behind the marble pillars and the heavy velvet curtains, their guns leveled with lethal intent at the heavy internal doors of the ballroom. They were wound tight, waiting for the single word to rush the street, ready to unleash a massive, overwhelming wave of retaliatory violence that would turn the freezing avenue outside into a gruesome, blood-soaked slaughterhouse. Bumpy took a slow, incredibly deliberate sip of his champagne, letting the cold bubbles dance on his tongue. He swallowed smoothly, his throat completely relaxed. He set the delicate crystal flute down on the table with a soft, precise, highly controlled clink. He looked up at Junie Bard, his dark, bottomless eyes entirely devoid of anger or panic. Instead, they were filled with a cold, terrifying, calculating brilliance. He saw exactly what the young, foolish shooters outside wanted. They wanted a chaotic, messy street war. They wanted Bumpy's disciplined men to lose their cool and rush out into the freezing night, firing wildly into the dark, drawing the immediate, furious attention of every police precinct in the borough. They wanted the chaotic spectacle. They wanted Bumpy to react emotionally. They wanted to drag the king down into the gutter with them. "No, Junie," Bumpy said smoothly, his voice calm, conversational, picking up a heavy silver dessert fork and slowly turning it over and over in his long fingers, admiring the intricate pattern on the handle. "It's entirely too freezing outside for a chase. Those boys are probably shivering in that car right now, catching their death of cold. It's very, very rude to leave guests out in the cold on a night like this." Junie frowned slightly, his thick, heavy brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He stared at his boss, his grip tightening slightly on the heavy Colt. "Boss, tell the men to stand down," Bumpy ordered, his voice suddenly carrying an absolute, unyielding, terrifying authority that left no room for debate. "Lower the weapons. Tell the outer guards in the foyer to fall back immediately." "And Junie?" "Yeah, Bumpy?" Junie asked, his voice tight. "Open the front doors. Swing them wide open. Let them see that the path is completely clear." Then, Bumpy turned his head slightly toward the terrified waitstaff cowering near the kitchen access. "And you," he murmured smoothly, "bring my small table and my dessert to the grand staircase landing. I wish to enjoy the view." Junie stared at him for a fraction of a second, his razor-sharp brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of the command. It went against every single survival instinct honed on the bloody streets of Harlem. You absolutely do not open the heavy gates to the castle when the barbarians are actively shooting at the walls. It was tactical suicide. But Junie Bird didn't follow mere instincts. He followed Bumpy Johnson. He knew, with absolute certainty, that when Bumpy gave an order that seemed completely insane, it meant the king was playing a complex, multi-layered game of psychological chess that no one else in the room possessed the intellect to even see. Junie gave a short, sharp, obedient nod. He didn't question it further. He turned away from the head table and raised his massive free hand high in the air, a clear visual signal to the 30 heavily armed enforcers scattered around the terrified ballroom. "Stand down." Junie barked, his voice booming and echoing powerfully off the vaulted ceiling. "Lower the pieces." I said lower them. "Step back into the shadows. Nobody fires. Do you hear me? I repeat, absolutely nobody fires." The hardened enforcers looked at each other from across the room in stunned, absolute disbelief. A few of them tightened their grips on their shotguns, their eyes pleading with Junie to reconsider. But the discipline of Bumpy Johnson's organization was forged in iron. Slowly, hesitantly, fighting every instinct in their bodies, the men lowered their handguns and their shotguns. They melted silently back into the deep, dark alcoves and the heavy shadows behind the thick velvet curtains, completely vanishing from sight. The room was suddenly dead quiet, save for the muffled sobbing of the guests on the floor. Junie moved quickly, his heavy shoes silent on the carpet, to the thick, reinforced internal double doors that separated the main ballroom from the elegant grand foyer. He keyed a small, expensive two-way radio clipped to his lapel. "Foyer detail. This is Junie. Fall back. I want you to open the main oak doors to the street. Open them all the way and lock them open. Then get out of sight immediately. Do it now." Outside, the chaotic, deafening roar of the gunfire suddenly, abruptly ceased. Sterling and his crew had completely emptied their high-capacity drum magazines. The heavy, metallic, hollow clicking of empty chambers dropping on spent pins echoed loudly in the freezing, dead quiet of the street. The biting air was suddenly thick with the acrid, burning, sulphurous smell of cordite and a thick, gray, choking haze of gun smoke that hung heavily in the mist. The beautiful front of the Lenox Grand was violently chewed to jagged splinters, the expensive brickwork deeply pockmarked with white, dusty impact craters. The lanterns were nothing but jagged iron stalks. Sterling was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, a manic, terrifying, adrenaline-fueled grin plastered across his sweaty, freezing face. "We did it, cats." He crowed loudly to the stunned men in the car, his voice trembling with sheer exhilaration. "We shot up the king's absolute castle. Reload. Get ready. They're going to come pouring out of those doors any second now. When they hit the sidewalk, light 'em up. Make 'em dance." The young, terrified shooters in the back seat frantically scrambled in the dark, their freezing, shaking hands struggling to slam fresh, heavy magazines into their empty weapons. They spilled unused shells onto the floorboards in their panic, completely intoxicated by a toxic, highly volatile cocktail of raw fear and absolute exhilaration. They stared intently through the misty, smoke-smeared windows, their gun barrels trained directly on the shattered, splintered entrance, desperately waiting for the furious swarm of Bumpy's armed guards to erupt violently into the street. They waited, their fingers twitching on the triggers. 5 incredibly long seconds passed, then 10, then 20 agonizing seconds. Absolutely nothing happened. There were no furious shouts from inside. There were no approaching police sirens in the distance. There was no chaotic, bloodthirsty stampede of armed men rushing the street to defend their revered boss's honor. There was only the eerie, profoundly unsettling, dead silence of the Harlem night, broken only by the soft, steady hiss of the freezing wind blowing off the river. Sterling's manic, triumphant grin slowly began to falter, cracking at the edges. The massive surge of adrenaline was starting to rapidly wear off, heavily replaced by a creeping, cold, paralyzing sense of utter confusion. His heart began to thump with a new, deeply unsettling rhythm. "What the hell are those jive cats doing in there?" he muttered, nervously wiping a thick line of freezing sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. "Why aren't they coming out? They should be flooding the street." Then, something completely terrifyingly impossible happened. Through the thick, dissipating haze of the gray gun smoke, Sterling watched in absolute paralyzed disbelief as the massive, heavy, splintered oak doors of the Lenox Grand, the very doors they had just spent 2 chaotic minutes trying to violently destroy, slowly, almost magically, began to move. They didn't burst open violently from a furious kick. They didn't swing wildly on broken hinges. Instead, they swung inward with a slow, highly deliberate, almost polite, welcoming smoothness. The heavy brass hinges, kept meticulously oiled, made absolutely no sound. The massive doors opened all the way, clicking softly as they locked into place against the interior walls of the building. Sterling stared, his jaw going completely slack. The entrance to the impenetrable fortress was wide open. From the freezing street, sitting in the dark car, they could see straight through the shattered, ruined exterior, straight through the secondary glass doors that were now propped open, and directly into the dimly lit, incredibly luxurious, sprawling expanse of the grand foyer. The foyer was completely, utterly empty. There were no armed guards violently crouching behind the expensive marble pillars. There were no angry men waiting in a deadly ambush. The path was completely, utterly clear. It looked as incredibly peaceful, quiet, and serene as an expensive museum long after the doors had closed to the public. The skinny driver of the Packard gripped the thin steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned a stark, bone-white. "Sterling, this ain't right, man," the driver whispered, his voice trembling violently, practically vibrating with sudden terror. "This is a straight ghost town. They ain't coming out. We should go right now. We made our point, man. We need to hit the gas and ghost before the bulls show up." But Sterling was staring intently at the open, inviting doors, his fractured, arrogant mind rapidly spinning a highly dangerous, completely delusional narrative. He didn't see a terrifying tactical anomaly. He didn't see the chilling, absolute, calculated restraint of a legendary master strategist who had survived 30 years on the bloody throne. He only saw his own twisted fantasy. He saw weakness. He saw complete, utter capitulation. "They ain't coming out because they're terrified," Sterling whispered, his eyes going wide with a sudden, arrogant, fatal realization. He turned to the men in the back. "You see that, cats? We just shot up the Godfather's legendary birthday party, and his high-priced men are hiding under the tables like rats." They opened the doors to show they surrender. The old man gave up. "Sterling, don't be a damn fool," one of the older boys in the back seat hissed urgently, his eyes darting frantically up and down the empty street. "It's a trap, man. Let's roll." "Shut up." Sterling snapped viciously, turning completely around in his seat, his eyes burning with a feverish, toxic, all-consuming ambition that completely blinded him to reality. "Do you have any idea what this is? This is absolute history. We don't just shoot the door and run away into the night like a bunch of street punks. The door is wide open. The guards ran away like cowards. If we walk in there right now, if we walk straight into that grand ballroom and take his crown right off his head while he's hiding under a damn tablecloth, we own this entire city. We own Harlem forever." It was the absolute, tragic logic of a fool, the profound hubris of a boy who entirely believed his own fabricated street myths. Without another word of debate, Sterling violently kicked his heavy car door open and stepped out into the freezing, biting wind. His heavy Thompson submachine gun was gripped tightly in his sweating hands, the cold steel a comfort to his racing heart. He didn't bother to crouch or stay low. He stood incredibly tall, puffing out his chest, completely, hopelessly intoxicated by the sudden delusion of his own invincibility. "Come on," Sterling ordered aggressively, waving the dark, smoking barrel of the heavy gun at the terrified men in the car. "We're going inside right now. We're going to finish the job and take the throne." Hesitantly, driven by a highly toxic mixture of peer pressure, raw fear of their leader, and the intoxicating, magnetic pull of Sterling's blinding confidence, the other three young shooters slowly stepped out of the black Packard. They formed up nervously behind him, their weapons raised shakily, their wide eyes darting nervously at the dark, silent windows of the surrounding apartment buildings, waiting for a sniper's bullet that never came. Sterling confidently took the lead. He walked slowly across the freezing, wet, slick pavement, his hard-soled leather shoes crunching loudly on the shattered glass of the destroyed lanterns. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the night. He felt exactly like a victorious conqueror stepping boldly onto newly claimed foreign soil. He reached the ruined threshold of the Lenox Grand. He paused for a single, heavy second, looking deeply into the dimly lit, perfectly, unnervingly silent foyer. The thick, expensive burgundy carpets absorbed every sound. The massive crystal chandelier hanging from the high, vaulted ceiling was heavily dimmed, casting the upper reaches of the room into long, strange, dancing shadows that completely obscured the architecture above. It was beautiful, incredibly elegant, and entirely, completely abandoned. Sterling smirked, a cruel, arrogant expression. He tightened his sweaty grip on the submachine gun, raised his chin in defiance of the ghosts of the past, and took his very first highly arrogant step over the threshold, leading his doomed crew out of the freezing, unforgiving night and directly into the waiting warmth of the king's castle. The fourth and final pair of hard-soled leather shoes crossed the heavy brass threshold, stepping fully off the freezing, sleet-covered concrete of the Harlem street and sinking deeply into the thick, luxurious expanse of the Lenox Grand's burgundy carpet. The sudden transition in the physical atmosphere was jarring to the senses. The vicious, biting wind that had been howling mercilessly off the dark, churning waters of the Harlem River followed them in, swirling the harsh, metallic, sulphurous stench of burned cordite and shattered brick dust into the entrance. but as they moved just a few feet deeper, past the immediate draft of the shattered doors, a thick, enveloping, almost suffocating wave of heavy, artificial heat fiercely fought back against the cold. It instantly began thawing their frozen, stiff faces and seeping deeply, painfully, into their shivering bones. The raw street exhaust was slowly overpowered by the rich, intoxicating, highly expensive aromas of a deeply exclusive world they categorically did not belong in. It was a complex, layered perfume of raw power and old money. There was the heavy, lingering scent of hand-rolled, imported Cuban tobacco hanging invisibly in the warm air. There was the sharp, masculine spice of top-shelf bay rum cologne, mingling seamlessly with the subtle, ghostly, incredibly delicate fragrance of gardenias and expensive French perfumes left behind in the panic by the fleeing wives and mistresses of the underworld elite. Sterling stood completely frozen in the dead center of the vast grand foyer, his narrow chest heaving with deep, ragged, arrogant breaths. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped, panicked bird, but it was no longer fueled entirely by fear. It was fueled by an incredibly dangerous, highly toxic surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline and blinding hubris. He actually believed, with every single misguided, foolish fiber of his desperately ambitious soul, that he had just accomplished the absolute, undeniable impossible. He had successfully breached the famously unbreachable fortress. He had walked straight through the shattered front doors of the king's castle, his weapon drawn, and he had been entirely, completely uncontested. A wide, manic, terrifyingly confident smile threatened to completely split his sweating, dirt-smudged face as he slowly, deliberately looked around the seemingly empty, silent room. The dimmed chandelier overhead cast the sprawling expanse, and the high, vaulted ceilings into deep pooling shadows that completely obscured the room's true dimensions. His heavy Thompson submachine gun was still gripped so tightly in his white-knuckled, shaking hands that his forearms ached with the intense, sustained strain. He felt like a titan of the streets. He felt like a mythological god walking among mere, terrified mortals. His deeply fractured mind was already frantically composing the legendary, immortal street ballad that would be sung about him on every corner in the 5 boroughs. It would be the epic, bloody story of how a 22-year-old no-name kid from the absolute bottom of the Bronx walked right into Bumpy Johnson's living room, kicked the old, tired lion off his comfortable throne, and violently took the heavy crown for his own. He took another slow, highly deliberate step forward, his wet leather shoes squeaking softly against the polished marble border that framed the deep burgundy carpet. The sound seemed incredibly, unnervingly loud in the absolute dead vacuum of the massive foyer. He looked to his left, his manic eyes frantically scanning the dark, polished wood of the abandoned coat check counter. Dozens of heavy mink coats, expensive cashmere scarves, and dark wool fedoras still hung neatly on their brass hooks, completely abandoned by their terrified owners in the sudden, chaotic rush to escape the gunfire. He looked to his right, his gaze sweeping over a small, elegant seating area featuring high-backed leather armchairs and a low mahogany coffee table. A single crystal ashtray sat on the table, a thin, gray ribbon of smoke still lazily curling up toward the high vaulted ceiling from the glowing cherry of an abandoned, half-smoked cigar. The entire scene was perfectly frozen in time, a pristine, flawlessly preserved diorama of sudden, interrupted luxury. It was too quiet. It was far, far too quiet. Behind Sterling, the skinny, terrified driver of the black Packard took a hesitant, trembling step inside, immediately flinching as a large, jagged shard of shattered glass from the wrought iron lanterns crunched loudly under the heel of his shoe. The driver's eyes were practically bulging out of his skull, darting frantically from corner to corner, desperately searching the deep, pooling shadows for the inevitable, terrifying retaliation he knew in his bones had to be coming. "Sterling," the driver whispered, his voice nothing more than a thin, reedy, pathetic squeak vibrating with pure, undiluted terror. "Sterling, this is wrong, man. This is all wrong. Where is everybody? Where are the guards? A place like this, the King's place, it shouldn't be empty. It shouldn't be dead like this. Shut your damn mouth and keep your peace raised." Sterling hissed viciously over his shoulder, completely refusing to let the driver's infectious panic shatter his own fragile, arrogant illusion of total victory. "They ain't here because they ran. You saw the doors open. You saw them surrender. They're probably all huddled together in the basement, crying in the dark. We own this room right now. We own this whole jive building." But true, absolute power in the Harlem underworld was never, ever loud. It didn't stupidly announce itself with a chaotic, uncoordinated hail of blind bullets fired from a moving car, nor did it manifest in the frantic, disorganized screaming of a terrified, panicking mob. True, enduring power was an absolute, suffocating, terrifying silence. It was a cold, calculated shadow that moved with lethal purpose precisely when you weren't looking. Before Sterling could even draw another full, arrogant breath of the warm, heavy, perfumed air, before his brain could form the words to bark his first triumphant command to the terrified, shivering boys huddled behind him, the thick, heavy, seemingly impenetrable shadows pooled deeply in the far right corner of the grand foyer suddenly, violently shifted. A massive, terrifying figure slowly, deliberately detached itself from the dark, intricately carved mahogany paneling of the wall. It didn't step forward into the dim light with a sudden frantic rush of aggressive, violent movement. It didn't shout a warning or rack the slide of a weapon to announce its deadly presence. Instead, the figure glided smoothly, silently, with the terrifying, entirely inevitable, terrifyingly graceful movement of a massive apex predator that had been patiently, flawlessly waiting in the tall grass for hours, entirely confident that the foolish prey would eventually wander right into its jaws. It was Junie Bird. Junie moved with a smooth, terrifying speed and physical economy that entirely, completely defied his massive, hulking, muscle-bound frame. He stepped out of the deep shadows and completely bypassed the four young, heavily armed intruders without making a single, solitary sound on the floorboards. He didn't draw his heavy, blued steel Colt 45 from the shoulder holster hidden beneath his perfectly tailored charcoal suit jacket. He didn't even bother to look at the four boys as he walked past them. His dark, incredibly cold, flat eyes were fixed solely, with absolute, unwavering laser focus, on his singular objective. Sterling, absolutely intoxicated by his own ego, only caught the absolute faintest, blurry hint of movement in his extreme peripheral vision, a sudden, unnatural displacement of the dim, ambient light. A sudden, cold chill, entirely unrelated to the freezing weather outside, violently spiked down his spine. He started to turn his head, his mouth opening wide to shout a panicked warning to his crew, his sweaty fingers desperately trying to tighten on the heavy trigger of the submachine gun, but his nervous system and his untrained reflexes were far, far too slow to react to a man who had survived 30 years in the life. Junie reached the shattered, violently splintered, bullet-chewed remains of the massive, incredibly heavy oak front doors. He didn't hesitate. With one massive, deeply calloused, incredibly powerful hand, he reached out and firmly grabbed the heavy brass handle of the right door. Despite the outer oak facing being chewed to jagged splinters by the Thompson, the massive, hardened steel core of the doors had held perfectly firm, and the heavy iron hinges remained flawlessly aligned. With a singular, brutal, sweeping motion fueled by pure, densely coiled, highly trained muscle, he yanked the massive, heavy door inward, violently fighting against the stiff, invisible resistance of the freezing wind howling in from the street outside. Slam. The sound was absolutely, physically deafening. It was not just the simple sound of a wooden door closing. It was the heavy, booming, catastrophic, finalized sound of a massive, impenetrable bank vault ceiling violently shut forever. The sheer physical concussion of the heavy, solid wood violently striking the reinforced steel doorframe shook the very floorboards beneath Sterling's cheap leather shoes, sending a sharp, terrifying, vibrating shockwave straight up his legs and into his chest. The sudden, explosive noise was a literal physical blow to the senses, a thunderclap of absolute doom that instantly, violently shattered the delicate, arrogant, entirely fabricated illusion of victory Sterling had so carefully built in his desperate mind. But Junie Bird was not finished. He was a man who believed in absolute, unbreakable certainty. He immediately reached up with terrifying, mechanical, practiced precision and firmly grabbed the massive, custom-forged, hardened industrial steel deadbolt that ran the entire horizontal width of the heavy double doors. He gripped the thick iron handle and violently threw the heavy mechanism across the greased track with a sickening, heavy metallic screech that set Sterling's teeth on edge. Clack thud. The massive lock fully engaged, the heavy solid steel cylinder slid deeply and securely into the reinforced iron housing set permanently into the solid brick wall of the building. The trap was perfectly, permanently, undeniably sprung. Sterling spun around, his wet shoes squeaking loudly on the marble, his heart leaping violently into his throat, his eyes wide with a sudden, overwhelming, entirely paralyzing spike of pure, undiluted terror. The inviting, open path directly behind them, their absolute only possible avenue of escape, back to the freezing, anonymous street and the perceived safety of the idling black Packard, was entirely, completely gone. They were sealed inside the fortress. The heavy, bullet-scarred oak doors stared blankly back at them, an unyielding, completely impenetrable wall of solid wood and heavy steel, and standing directly in front of those locked doors, perfectly blocking the only exit with his massive, utterly immovable, mountain-like body, was Junie Bird. Junie slowly, casually turned around to face the four trapped boys. He reached up and very calmly, very deliberately dusted a small, almost invisible speck of white plaster dust off the wide lapel of his expensive charcoal suit jacket. He still hadn't drawn his weapon. He clearly didn't feel the need to. He just stood there with his massive arms resting easily at his sides, staring at them with absolute, empty, profoundly chilling indifference. He wasn't looking at them as a credible, dangerous threat. He was looking at them with the mild, exhausted annoyance of a man staring at a disgusting mess on the floor that he was eventually, inevitably going to have to clean up with a mop and a bucket. "Hey!" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking violently in the middle of the word, entirely stripped of its former deep, booming street bravado. The sound that came out of his throat was high, thin, incredibly desperate, and laced with absolute raw panic. "What the hell is this, man? Open the jive door. Open it right now. We came to see the king." Junie Bard did not say a single solitary word in response. He didn't even blink his cold, dead eyes. He simply crossed his massive tree trunk arms slowly over his broad chest, planted his feet firmly shoulder-width apart on the carpet, and silently waited.
Then, without a single verbal command spoken, without a single solitary warning of any kind to prepare their senses, the suffocating, dim, atmospheric shadows of the grand foyer were instantly, violently, painfully eradicated from existence. A massive, deeply hidden bank of high-intensity industrial-grade halogen floodlights, rigged specifically along the upper architectural molding of the high, vaulted ceiling for this exact terrifying, highly specific tactical purpose, snapped on simultaneously with a harsh, loud electrical crack.
That sounded like a dry lightning strike inside the room. It was absolutely not the warm, inviting, golden, highly flattering illumination of a high society birthday gala. It was the blinding, searing, sterile, deeply unforgiving, brutal white light of a police interrogation room or a surgical operating theater, magically magnified 100 times over. It hit the sensitive, dark, adjusted retinas of the four young men with the immense, agonizing physical force of a heavy, closed fist striking them directly in the face. Sterling cried out loudly in sudden, excruciating, physical pain, instinctively throwing his left arm violently up over his face, tightly squeezing his watering eyes completely shut against the agonizing, searing glare. The other three boys standing behind him practically dropped their heavy weapons in their desperate shock, frantically shielding their faces with both hands, stumbling blindly backward into each other in a chaotic, terrified panic, whining and cursing as they tripped over their own feet. The artificial light was so intensely, unnaturally bright that it physically seemed to bleach the rich, dark color right out of the expensive burgundy carpet, instantly turning the beautiful, elegant foyer into a stark, glaring, terrifying, completely exposed arena of death. It took 5 agonizing, endless, terrifying seconds for Sterling's retinas to even partially adjust to the searing, violent brilliance burning through his eyelids, when he finally, slowly, painfully lowered his trembling, sweaty arm, squinting hard through the hot tears streaming rapidly down his dirty face. The true, deeply horrifying, absolute reality of his incredibly dire situation finally, crushingly dawned on his fractured mind. The sheer, unadulterated, deeply paranoid tactical genius of Bumpy Johnson's architectural design was suddenly laid completely, terrifyingly bare for him to see. Sterling realized, with a sudden, sickening, absolute plunge in his stomach that made him feel violently nauseous, that they had not simply stepped up into a standard flat grand entrance hall. The polished floor of the foyer gently, almost imperceptibly sloped downward from the front door toward the center of the room. They had walked blindly, arrogantly, directly into a sunken, heavily fortified, inescapable pit. It was a perfectly designed, flawlessly executed, deeply strategic dead-end kill box, and Sterling and his 3 terrified friends were standing right in the absolute unprotected dead center of the massive bullseye. Sterling's panicked, wide, tear-filled eyes desperately tracked upward, following the smooth, towering lines of the expensive marble pillars that elegantly supported the high, vaulted ceiling. 15 feet directly above their heads, wrapping entirely around the outer perimeter of the sunken foyer in a perfect, inescapable horseshoe shape, was a wide, highly elegant mezzanine balcony. It was fronted by a low, incredibly heavy balustrade made of solidly carved dark oak. During normal, peaceful, highly civilized evenings, the mezzanine was simply a beautiful architectural feature, a place for an expensive string quartet to sit and play soft, classical music to set the mood for the arriving, wealthy guests below. Tonight, however, the elegant mezzanine was an elevated, heavily armed firing squad. Standing perfectly shoulder to shoulder along the entire, curving length of the wrap-around balcony, looking straight down into the brightly lit pit with cold, ruthless, absolutely murderous intent, were 30 of Harlem's absolute deadliest, most heavily battle-hardened enforcers. These were absolutely not young, nervous, untested boys trying to make a fake name for themselves by shooting up a building from a moving car. These were grown, serious, incredibly dangerous men. They were the hardened, scarred veterans of the bloody, brutal street wars of the previous decades. They were men who had killed before, who had buried bodies in the dead of night, who didn't sweat under pressure, who didn't flinch at the sight of blood, and who definitely, absolutely never missed their assigned targets. Sterling's breath hitched painfully in his incredibly tight, burning chest, refusing to go down into his lungs. He stared up at the elevated gallery of absolute death, completely, physically paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming, statistically impossible odds of his situation. The 30 enforcers stood perfectly, unnervingly still, creating a terrifying, unbroken wall of dark, tailored suits, heavy wool overcoats, and pulled-down fedoras. And every single one of those 30 hardened men held a high-powered, extremely lethal weapon leveled directly, completely unwaveringly, at the heads of the 4 young men trapped helplessly in the brightly lit pit below. The thick, heavy, suffocating silence in the brightly lit foyer was suddenly, violently broken by a sound that would undoubtedly haunt Sterling's darkest nightmares for whatever incredibly short, miserable amount of time he had left on this earth. It wasn't the sound of a human voice shouting an order. It wasn't the sound of a police siren approaching in the distance. It was the perfectly synchronized, terrifyingly crisp, highly metallic, incredibly heavy symphony of 30 mechanical gun safeties clicking off absolutely simultaneously. Clack, clack. The sound was sharp, brutal, and entirely finalized. It violently echoed off the hard marble walls and the high-vaulted ceiling like the ringing of a massive iron death knell. The long, dark, blued steel barrels of heavy pump-action shotguns, the gleaming, polished silver muzzles of massive .357 Magnum revolvers, and the dark, deadly, highly precise scopes of lever-action hunting rifles were all pointed straight down at a steep angle, perfectly creating a solid, mathematically inescapable, completely lethal net of intersecting crossfire. There was absolutely zero cover in the center of the room. There were no heavy tables to dive behind. There were no deep shadows left to hide in. There was absolutely nowhere to run, nowhere to duck, nowhere to pray. If any single one of those 30 highly trained men merely twitched their index finger on the trigger, the 4 boys trapped in the pit would be instantly, violently, completely erased from physical existence, turned into nothing more than a fine pink wet mist, instantly staining the expensive burgundy carpet. The skinny, terrified driver standing directly behind Sterling finally, completely broke under the immense, crushing psychological pressure. He began to openly, loudly sob. It was a pathetic, completely broken, high-pitched, incredibly humiliating whimpering sound that echoed horribly in the absolute, dead quiet of the brightly lit room. "Oh God! Oh merciful God, Sterling," the driver whimpered, his voice heavily choked with thick mucus and hot tears, his entire body shaking so violently he looked like he was vibrating. "They got us. They completely got us, man. We're dead. We're already dead. We're ghosts, Sterling. were dead ghosts. Sterling desperately tried to speak, tried with every ounce of his remaining willpower to force some brave, defiant, street-tough words past the tight, dry sandpaper lump blocking his throat, but his vocal cords were completely, chemically paralyzed by the pure, undiluted, animalistic terror, heavily flooding every single nerve, ending in his system. The heavy Thompson submachine gun, currently resting in his sweaty hands, which only 5 short minutes ago had felt exactly like the ultimate, undeniable symbol of his incredible newfound power, now felt like a massive, incredibly heavy lead anchor, slowly, inevitably dragging his soul down to hell. His arms were shaking so violently, completely outside of his conscious control, that the heavy metal sling of the gun rattled audibly against the cheap plastic buttons of his plaid suit jacket. Then, another sound, entirely different from the heavy click of gun mechanics, slowly cut through the incredibly tense, heavy, suffocating air of the room. It was the incredibly soft, highly refined, impossibly delicate, almost musical sound of pure silver gently, precisely striking fine-bone china. Clink. Sterling's wide, deeply terrified, bloodshot eyes violently snapped away from the terrifying wall of guns pointed at him from above, and he desperately followed the delicate sound. He looked to the far, deep end of the long grand foyer, past the high, smooth marble pillars, to the incredibly grand, sweeping, highly carpeted staircase that led majestically up to the private second floor of the exclusive club. At the very top of the wide, softly carpeted stairs, perfectly bathed in a soft, highly focused, beautifully warm spotlight that flawlessly isolated him from the chaotic, glaring tension of the room below, sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The undisputed godfather of Harlem had absolutely not rushed frantically down to the foyer in a desperate panic to assess the situation. He had not angrily drawn a weapon to personally, violently execute the young, foolish punks who had dared to publicly disrespect his name and ruin his private celebration. He had not yelled for his guards. He had simply, calmly, gracefully relocated his birthday celebration. His small, beautifully ornate, highly polished antique mahogany table had been quickly and incredibly quietly moved out of the main ballroom and placed directly onto the landing at the very top of the grand stairs, exactly as he had instructed. It was perfectly covered with a pristine, heavily starched, snow-white linen tablecloth. Sitting casually behind the table, resting comfortably in a high-backed, deeply tufted, dark velvet upholstered armchair, looking straight down at the trapped intruders with the calm, completely detached, deeply analytical observation of a brilliant scientist examining common, insignificant insects trapped under the glass of a microscope, was the king himself. Bumpy looked absolutely, breathtakingly immaculate. The rich, dark midnight blue fabric of his incredibly expensive custom-tailored tuxedo was perfectly, flawlessly pressed, completely and utterly unwrinkled by the sudden, explosive violence that had just erupted directly outside his front doors. The crisp, blindingly white lines of his heavily starched shirt collar were completely flawless. His posture was deeply regal, entirely relaxed, incredibly, completely at ease in the center of the storm. He wasn't leaning forward aggressively in his chair in a fit of rage. He wasn't gripping the padded arms of his chair in nervous tension. Resting exactly in the dead center of the small, antique mahogany table was a gleaming, highly polished, pure silver platter, and sitting delicately on that silver platter was a large, generous, beautifully cut slice of deep, incredibly rich, blood-red velvet cake, beautifully and thickly frosted with bright, pristine white icing. Sterling stared blankly up at the top of the sweeping stairs, his deeply fractured, rapidly breaking mind completely failing to process the surreal, totally impossible, deeply terrifying image presented before him. He had fully expected loud, angry shouting. He had expected violent, uncontrollable rage. He had expected a brutal, chaotic, incredibly violent, bloody firefight to the death. He had never, in his absolute wildest, most deeply arrogant, highly delusional dreams, ever expected to be completely trapped, staring helplessly down the barrels of 30 high-powered guns, while the legendary man he had specifically come to humiliate and kill sat comfortably at a beautiful table, quietly, peacefully eating his birthday dessert. Bumpy didn't even have a massive bodyguard standing directly over his shoulder to protect him. He didn't have a heavy, loaded weapon resting visibly on the white tablecloth for easy access. He simply didn't need them. His absolute protection was not physical steel or muscle. His protection was the sheer, terrifying, invisible, crushing weight of his absolute, unquestioned authority over the entire city. Slowly, highly deliberately, moving with the graceful, unhurried ease of a man who possesses all the time in the world, Bumpy Johnson raised his right hand. Between his incredibly long, elegant, perfectly manicured fingers, he lightly held a small, highly polished, antique silver dessert fork. He didn't bother to look up at the 30 heavily armed men aiming their lethal rifles from the balcony. He didn't bother to look down at Junie Bird standing silently, blocking the locked front door. He locked his cold, dark, incredibly deep obsidian eyes squarely, flawlessly, directly onto Sterling. The intense, unwavering gaze hit Sterling with an immense, physical, entirely paralyzing force that almost buckled his trembling knees. It was far heavier than the freezing, biting wind outside. It was far heavier and infinitely more terrifying than the 30 loaded guns pointed directly at his skull. Bumpy's deep eyes were completely, utterly devoid of any normal human emotion. There was absolutely no trace of hot anger. There was no hint of sudden fear. There was no burning hatred. There was only a profound, infinite, entirely terrifying, cold emptiness. It was the deeply unsettling look of a man who had seen everything this brutal world had to offer, done everything it required, and survived everything it threw at him. It was the look of a man who implicitly, fundamentally understood the absolute, undeniable truth of the universe, that Sterling, the boy shivering in the pit with a gun he was too terrified to use, was entirely, completely, utterly insignificant. "You're making a terrible, muddy mess of my beautiful carpet, young man," Bumpy said. His voice was a low, incredibly smooth, deeply resonant, gravelly rumble. He didn't shout the words. He didn't raise his volume by even a fraction of a decibel. Yet, the perfect architectural acoustics of the massive, vaulted grand foyer carried his quiet, conversational, deeply relaxed tone perfectly, flawlessly to every single, brightly lit corner of the room. His voice instantly commanded absolute, unquestioned silence from everything else in existence. The highly terrified, sobbing driver immediately, violently choked on his own hot tears, aggressively biting his bottom lip hard enough to draw dark blood just to physically force himself to stop making another pathetic sound. Sterling's jaw trembled completely uncontrollably. A cold, incredibly thick bead of terrified sweat broke out on his forehead, rolling slowly, agonizingly down the side of his dirty face, stinging his left eye with salt. He desperately tried to grip his heavy submachine gun tighter, tried to mentally summon even a fraction of the reckless, wild, highly toxic energy that had aggressively fueled him all night long, but it was completely, entirely gone. It had entirely evaporated into the warm air the exact microsecond the heavy steel deadbolt had slammed shut behind him. We ain't scared of you, old man," Sterling desperately stammered out, his voice instantly betraying his complete lack of courage, cracking humiliatingly on the very last syllable. He sounded precisely like what he truly was, a deeply terrified, incredibly foolish, hopelessly outmatched little boy who had drastically, fatally overstepped his very limited bounds in a world of serious men. In an incredibly stupid, highly reflexive, purely instinctual act of false, suicidal defiance, Sterling slightly twitched his arms, beginning to slowly raise the heavy, dark barrel of the Thompson submachine gun just a few inches toward the stairs. Before the cold muzzle of the heavy gun could even move a full inch, the absolutely deafening, terrifying sound of 30 heavy, metal hammers being pulled back entirely to full cock violently echoed through the massive room, a sharp, metallic, unified warning of impending, massive violence that literally vibrated in the enamel of Sterling's back teeth. At the top of the stairs, Bumpy Johnson didn't even flinch at the massive, threatening sound of the 30 weapons preparing to fire. He didn't even blink his dark eyes. He simply, calmly lowered the small silver fork toward the center of the large slice of red velvet cake. "I highly, strongly suggest you don't do that, son," Bumpy said softly, his deep tone almost gentle, almost entirely conversational, like a deeply tired, incredibly patient schoolteacher gently correcting a particularly slow, fundamentally ignorant child. "If you raise that heavy piece of iron even an inch higher, my men up there will immediately unleash a volume of heavy lead into this beautiful foyer that will instantly turn you and your deeply foolish friends into a fine, wet paste. It will take my highly paid cleaning staff an entire week just to scrub what's left of you out of the marble grout. And I really, truly, deeply despise having a messy house on the night of my birthday." Sterling instantly froze perfectly solid, his entire muscular system locked up incredibly tight, entirely paralyzed by fear. The dark barrel of the heavy submachine gun pointed uselessly, safely at the floorboards. He realized with absolute, crushing, entirely devastating clarity that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just lightly threatening him to scare him. He was completely, calmly stating an objective, indisputable scientific fact of physics. If Sterling merely twitched a single muscle out of place, he would instantly die. If he breathed too heavily, he would instantly die. If he blinked aggressively, he would instantly die. His very life, his very continued existence on the planet, was absolutely no longer his own. It rested entirely, completely, wholly on the delicate whim of the quiet, immaculate man calmly slicing a piece of cake at the top of the stairs. Directly behind Sterling, the immense, suffocating, entirely unbearable psychological pressure finally became far too much for the terrified, trapped crew to bear for another second. The thin, deeply fragile, completely unbreakable string of tension holding their nerves together violently snapped. The young, deeply sobbing, utterly terrified driver was the absolute first to completely, entirely break. With a loud, highly pathetic, desperate gasp for air, he violently released his white-knuckled, sweating grip on the heavy loaded .45 caliber pistol he had been shakingly pointing at the floor. Clatter. The heavy, dark steel of the loaded gun violently hit the polished marble border, framing the thick carpet with a sharp, incredibly loud, echoing metallic ring. It slid rapidly for a few inches before coming to a complete, final stop against the wall. The terrified driver immediately threw both of his shaking, empty hands high into the brightly lit air, immediately falling hard to both of his knees, violently burying his crying face deeply into his sweating hands. weeping loudly and completely uncontrollably like a frightened child. "I give up. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't shoot. Please, man, please don't shoot me. I didn't want to come. I swear to God I didn't want to. Sterling made me do it. He made us come here." The sudden, loud, highly metallic sound of the dropped weapon entirely broke the terrified trance of the other two boys standing directly behind Sterling. The deeply terrifying, entirely fabricated illusion of their tough street gang was entirely, permanently shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The kid, aggressively holding the loaded, sawed-off shotgun, let out a long, highly shaky, terrified breath, slowly closed his tearing eyes, and simply opened his hands, letting the incredibly lethal weapon slip easily from his sweating fingers. It hit the thick carpet with a heavy, dull, deeply pathetic thud. He slowly, deliberately raised his trembling, empty hands high above his head, stepping far away from the fallen gun, his head deeply bowed down toward his chest in complete, utter, unconditional defeat. Within exactly 5 seconds, 3 of the 4 young, rogue shooters had completely, unconditionally surrendered, entirely abandoning their loaded weapons, abandoning their supposed leader, and abandoning all of their deeply foolish pride without a single, solitary shot ever being fired from the inside of the room. They clearly recognized true, absolute, unyielding power, and they instantly, completely yielded to it. Sterling was left entirely, completely alone. He stood perfectly isolated in the exact dead center of the brightly lit, sunken pit, perfectly illuminated by the searing halogen lights, the absolute only man left, still holding a weapon in his hands. The heavy Thompson submachine gun, which he had so loudly, so arrogantly bragged just an hour ago, would instantly make him the brand new, undisputed king of Harlem, now felt exactly like a massive, burning block of red-hot iron melting directly into his deeply sweating hands. He slowly looked to his left, then to his right, deeply seeing the broken, sobbing forms of his crew on their knees on the floor, completely, utterly broken. He slowly, painfully looked up at the 30 unblinking, heavily armed, entirely silent enforcers staring directly down at him from the balcony, their fingers tight on the triggers. He slowly looked back at the massive, locked, entirely impenetrable oak doors, where Junie Bird simply stood with a look of incredibly bored, deeply terrifying patience. Finally, entirely out of tactical options, entirely out of breath, entirely out of lies, and entirely out of courage, Sterling slowly, painfully looked back up the grand, sweeping staircase. Bumpy Johnson was patiently watching him. The king of Harlem had not stopped his slow, incredibly methodical, deeply elegant movements. With perfect, elegant grace, Bumpy gently pressed the polished edge of the small silver dessert fork deeply into the rich, dense, red velvet cake. He smoothly, flawlessly sliced off a small, absolutely perfect piece, making sure to deliberately catch a generous, thick dollop of the bright, sweet white frosting. The entire grand foyer was held in absolute, deeply breathless, highly pressurized suspension. The 30 trained enforcers held their fingers perfectly, rigidly still on their hair triggers. The terrified, kneeling boys held their ragged breath. The absolute only sound left in the massive, brightly lit room was the soft, ragged, deeply desperate, highly panicked panting of Sterling's own terrified breathing. He had entirely, completely lost. He hadn't just been tactically defeated, he had been entirely, psychologically, thoroughly dismantled from the inside out. Bumpy Johnson had completely, flawlessly stripped away his ego, his weapon, his crew, and every single ounce of his dignity without ever once raising his voice or even bothering to leave his comfortable velvet upholstered chair. The legendary Godfather had just proven, absolutely beyond a single shadow of a doubt, exactly why he rightfully held the heavy crown, and exactly why a foolish, loud boy from the Bronx could never, ever in a million lifetimes even hope to take it from him. Slowly, his entire skinny body trembling completely violently, with deeply profound shame, absolute terror, and the massive, crushing, suffocating weight of total, unconditional defeat, Sterling slowly opened his heavily sweating, shaking hands. The heavy Thompson submachine gun slipped freely from his completely numb fingers. It hit the thick, expensive burgundy carpet with a heavy, deeply muffled, incredibly pathetic thud. The dark gun bounced slightly once, the heavy canvas strap tangling awkwardly around the blued steel barrel, before coming to rest completely permanently near the toe of Sterling's polished, wet leather shoes. Sterling didn't even bother to raise his hands in surrender.
He just deeply, completely slumped his narrow shoulders forward, staring blankly, heavily down at the patterned floor, totally unconditionally defeated in every possible way a man could be defeated. The frantic, ambitious fight was completely, entirely gone from his wide eyes, replaced entirely, wholly by the hollow, deep, incredibly empty, profoundly terrified stare of a man who suddenly realizes he has walked completely blindly, entirely voluntarily, directly into his own deep, dark grave.
At the very top of the grand, sweeping staircase, Bumpy Johnson slowly, gracefully raised the small silver fork to his mouth. He placed the small, perfect, highly frosted bite of rich red velvet cake directly onto his tongue, slowly closed his dark, intelligent eyes for a brief, incredibly brief fraction of a second, and chewed extremely slowly, deeply savoring the rich, sweet, complex flavor. He swallowed smoothly, his throat completely relaxed, completely, entirely unbothered by the heavy, suffocating, lethal tension filling the massive room below him. He reached out with his free left hand, lightly picked up an incredibly expensive, heavily embroidered, pristine white linen napkin, and deeply delicately, highly precisely dabbed the absolute corners of his mouth. He set the white napkin back down smoothly onto the table, folding it perfectly, flawlessly in half with 2 fingers. He placed the silver fork down gently next to the silver plate with a very soft, highly definitive, final clink. Then, very slowly, Bumpy Johnson leaned slightly forward in his high-backed velvet chair. He rested his elbows elegantly, perfectly on the edge of the small mahogany table, slowly folding his long, manicured hands together in a steepled position directly beneath his chin. He looked straight down into the brightly lit, sunken pit, his dark, bottomless, incredibly cold eyes locking perfectly, entirely onto Sterling's completely broken, deeply terrified, utterly defeated gaze. The heavy silence stretched incredibly tight, becoming an actual physical pressure in the room, making it incredibly, painfully hard for anyone trapped in the pit to even draw a breath. Bumpy let the absolute, undiluted terror deeply marinate. He let the young, incredibly foolish boy profoundly feel the full, completely crushing, absolutely devastating weight of his monumental, highly fatal mistake. He purposefully let him stand there entirely frozen in the blinding, searing halogen light, completely surrounded by the highly lethal guns, completely surrounded by his weeping, broken crew, completely, thoroughly stripped of absolutely everything he ever thought he was. Finally, after an eternity of silence, Bumpy spoke. His voice was incredibly, terrifyingly soft, a low, smooth, incredibly deadly, highly polished purr that drifted smoothly down the grand carpeted staircase and wrapped itself tightly, securely around Sterling's throat, exactly like a perfectly tightened piano wire. "My mother was a very, very wise, deeply traditional woman," Bumpy said slowly, his tone almost highly nostalgic, almost deeply conversational, perfectly echoing through the dead, heavy quiet of the vast foyer. He tilted his head slightly to the side, keeping his cold, entirely unblinking eyes perfectly, flawlessly locked onto Sterling's trembling face. "She taught me a great many highly important things about deep respect, about true dignity, and exactly about how a proper gentleman must always properly, flawlessly conduct himself in this harsh, unforgiving world." Bumpy paused for a highly calculated second. He deliberately let the heavy words hang suspended in the warm, perfumed air. He watched with a complete lack of empathy as the very last drop of color completely, entirely drained from Sterling's heavily sweating face, leaving his skin a sickly, deeply terrified, ash-gray shade of pure death. The young boy's thin lips were trembling violently, desperately, pathetically trying to form words, desperate apologies, incredibly begging pleas for mercy that he knew, deep in his terrified soul, would never, ever be heard or considered. Bumpy slowly, gracefully leaned back against the plush velvet upholstery of his chair, fully returning to his perfect, deeply relaxed, highly regal posture. He calmly reached out, lightly picked up his delicate crystal champagne flute, and held it up gracefully to the light, taking a moment to quietly admire the steady, perfect stream of tiny, rising bubbles. He slowly looked back down at the brightly lit pit, his handsome expression entirely, completely unreadable, a highly perfect, flawless mask of cold, unyielding, absolute power. "Yes," Bumpy Johnson stated incredibly calmly, his deep, resonant voice suddenly ringing with absolute, terrifying, highly unshakable finality that left absolutely no room for debate. "She taught me to absolutely always open the door for my guests, but she never, ever said I had to let you leave."
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.